Photography 1, Lecture 8, Time Exposure and Low Light Photography. I mentioned the work of Michael Canna in the last lecture and his natural landscape photography. And this is also by him and is but of a very different type. This is made in the evening, and because the exposure is very long, more than likely at least 20 or 30 minutes, the stars are recorded as these curved streaks in the sky because of the rotation of the Earth in relation to them. He also has, in this instance, an image taken at night, but rather than seeing the stars streaking in the sky, we actually see clouds because they're in the process of rolling through the frame, have blurred, while the pilings in the water and the water itself, well, not the water, but the pilings have remained nice and clear because the camera's on a tripod and it's not going anywhere, and as a result they're nice and sharp. From the very beginning of photography, the long exposure has been a part of the process. The very first image, in fact, if you may remember, took an entire day to make, just to expose the emulsion to light. This is by L.J.M. Daguerre, who was one of the people who subsequently released a version of photography. And this is no doubt a tableau that was allowed to be exposed for a period of a period of time. Don't know exactly what the exposure time was, but it would have been very long. The emulsions were very slow and inconsistent, and but required a great deal of light to build up in order to record an image. This is by Eugene Cheh, made considerably later than the Daguerre, but I include it here because it illustrates what can happen unexpectedly. This doesn't happen, well, it actually does happen in Cheh's a fair amount, although most of them it's much harder to see. Here someone interrupted him in the process of making this image of the front of I think this is probably a bar or a restaurant, and looks like a delivery man was going through with a wheelbarrow or a hand truck or something, and as a result of his moving towards the camera, was in the frame long enough that the sort of ghost image is now visible. This is by Edward Steichen, and it is of Rodin's sculpture of Balzac, and unbelievable to me, made apparently at midnight. The notion that the moon was able to provide this amount of light is quite remarkable to me, although I absolutely believe it, because photography is a light collecting process, and if one is to leave the lens open to light long enough, it will collect enough in order for an image like this to appear. This has I think, a beautiful, evocative quality to it. It has a sense of mystery, but also power in it. Steichen was interested in experimenting with a number of different kinds of objects in very low light situations. This was also, these roses were taken in virtual darkness. I think they may have also been lit by the moon. And because the light is at such a low level, this took a number of hours to expose. And one of the things that he discovered was that the in the course of that exposure, the rose's petals had begun to wilt, so there is some, it's very difficult to see, but there is actually some blurring that has occurred as a result of the movement of the petals as they've curled up to eventually die. This is by Brassai. Brassai was a Hungarian photographer who lived in Paris and made it his mission to document Paris in the 20s and 30s almost exclusively at night. As a result, he did a lot of experimentation with scenes like this one, where we see a kiosk lit from behind quite dramatically in the fog, and there's a lone figure, the silhouette of which is all that's visible. This is typical of his work is a sense of mystery. It runs through just about all of it. This is one of my favorite images of all time, also by Brassai, of one of the gargoyles on Notre Dame. And again, this is quite a long exposure. But what I like about it is that it's this sort of portrait of the gargoyle, who is darkly lit but still visible, and but with the city of Paris in the background, apparently well lit up and very bright. It was referred to as the City of Light, and this certainly is no exception, but an exceptional image. This image by Beverly Abbott is taken from the Chrysler Building, looking down on the city of New York, and this was made in 1932 and was considered a fairly radical image, the idea that you would aim down and not have a horizon, and also taken at night. Sets it apart. It's quite dramatic. It's extremely contrasty, high contrast, and it is black and it's white, and there is some gray in between, but it's predominantly black and white. This is by Bill Brandt, and he's a German who lived and worked in England, and who was interested in also in night studies. In this instance, this isn't quite a night study, but it's certainly very late in the day, and it was very dark when the image was made. This is another image of Brandt's, a more urban scene, but again, this is taken by moonlight in London, and I think very evocative of the city, which at the time was still plagued with terrible fog, which was, it turned out, largely created by all of the coal burning that had been done. Now, I've talked about this image before by Ansel Adams, and although it was technically taken during the last moments of daylight, I think of this really as kind of a nocturnal study. It has the moon in it, and the light was very dark, and although there are details to be seen in the little town of Hernandez, they are definitely muted. This is by Georgetice, and taken in New Jersey in the 1970s, and it ostensibly documents a gas station, but what really makes this a powerful image is the water tower just behind it, which is almost in total darkness, but not quite. So we see it as sort of this ominous presence in the background. And this is all just about finding a scene like this where you have considerable light in the foreground and little light in the background. This is by Robert Adams, another photographer that I've shown you work of. And in this case, a scene in, I believe this is in Colorado, where he was from originally. And he's very interested in communities that are on the outskirts and on the edge of wilderness. And in this case, the lit area is very contained within this area in the center of the image. And we've got this dramatic sky where the sun has gone down and it's getting darker. This is by Hiroshi Sugimoto, a Japanese photographer who's lived and worked in New York for a long time. And I think I may have shown another of his pieces from this series. He first came to prominence with this body of work where he photographed in old movie theaters. And being very conceptual in his approach to photography, he would set up his camera at the beginning of a film, open the lens, and not close it again until the end of the film. So however much light it collected, that's what illuminated the theater, and always with this backlight coming from the screen. So we get this very kind of high contrast and evocative view of the theater with a white void in the middle of it. This is by Todd Edo, who has done extensive studies in the suburbs, photographing various kinds of houses at night, and they have a very mysterious quality to them, which he fosters by where he places the camera and what he includes. There's often quite a bit of shadowy elements like these trees and the shadows on the house from the trees as well, with lights on inside. But there's this kind of ominous quality to them. While this is quite bright by comparison, it also has a kind of brooding, not exactly welcoming quality to it. This is by Len Gential, who has done a lot of work, some of it at night, of great estates. And in this case, this is actually a garden in New York and photographed at night. You can see in the background there's quite a bit of light in what appears to be the city, or a city. And in the foreground we have this light that's being filtered through the trees, more than likely moonlight. Michael Westerly is a German photographer who has specialized in extremely long exposures. This one took approximately a year to make. He finds discrete places where he can set up his cameras, and he opens the shutter and leaves them in place for a year, 2 years, 3 years at times, and whatever happens in front of it from that location is what ends up being recorded. This was actually made at the Museum of Modern Art. And there was apparently construction being done, so there are layers of information that are not easy to distinguish, that give this view a very kind of unsettling quality to it, and fascinating at the same time. This is by Abelardo Morell, a Cuban-American photographer who has turned various spaces into camera obscuras. I had mentioned camera obscura in an earlier lecture, and I believe shown some of his work then. This is a hotel room, I believe, or an apartment, which has a view of the Brooklyn Bridge, which is shown here inverted, which is what naturally occurs when an image has not used either a lens or a prism to turn it right side. So we have the image of the Brooklyn Bridge projected on upside down, projected on a right side up image of a room. So you see the bed on the bottom and picture on the wall. This is the same condition that we see this time taken in Venice in Italy. And again, with this one in particular, I think there's really a beautiful balance between the projected image and the furnishings of the space in the foreground. And the results, I think, are quite beautiful.